good evening, or good morning, depending on how late you've stayed awake tonight, wherever you're listening from. A quiet bedroom, a car idling at the edge of a long road, or a place where sleep keeps circling without ever quite landing. You're not alone. Tonight's broadcast is not about monsters in the dark. It's about the spaces we pass through every day without looking twice. The cemetery after midnight, a penthouse with too much glass, a scaffold hanging 8 floors above the ground, a barber shop that should have closed an hour earlier, a hospital room where the machines keep time better than we do. Each story you're about to hear stands on its own, but they all share one quiet truth. Some places remember us, some mistakes don't stay buried, and some nights don't end when the lights come back on. So before we begin, take a breath. Lower the volume just enough that you can still hear the room around you. Let the edges of the world soften. If you're listening to this before sleep, don't worry. Nothing here will chase you. These stories don't need to. They'll simply stay with you. The graveyard shift. The wind moved first. Not loudly, not violently, but with the careful patience of something that knew the cemetery better than Elijah ever would, sliding between the headstones and tugging at the hem of his jacket as if testing whether he was real, whether he could feel it, while the last smear of sunset clung to the horizon like a dying bruise, and the iron gates behind him groaned shut with a sound that felt less like metal and more like a warning he chose not to understand. Because Elijah had learned long ago that fear only gained power when you gave it language, and language was exactly what he refused to give the place as he began his graveyard shift on the night when autumn finally tipped over into cold. He paused near the caretaker's shed, listening, the way he always did at the start of a shift, not because he believed in ghosts or omens or the theatrical superstitions the locals whispered about this place, but because silence had weight here, and the cemetery had its own breathing rhythm, a soft percussion of insects hidden in tall grass, the faint clink of the distant bell tower marking the half hour, and beneath it all, something slower, deeper, like the earth itself settling its bones. Elijah checked his watch. Midnight. Halloween, technically, though the moon hung too thin and pale to feel festive, more like a fragment of bone caught in the sky. He adjusted the flashlight on his belt, felt the reassuring press of his phone in his pocket, and started his round. The path curved gently through the newer plots first, neat rows of polished stone reflecting the flashlight's beam in dull, obedient glimmers, names and dates carved clean and recent, grief still sharp enough to cut, but familiar, manageable, the kind Elijah understood. These were the graves people visited, the ones that smelled of fresh flowers and rain-soaked soil, the ones that belonged to stories that still had living witnesses. He walked past them with an almost professional indifference, boots crunching softly on gravel, his breath fogging in short, controlled bursts, telling himself, as he always did, that this was just another night, just another job, just another stretch of hours where nothing happened if you didn't go looking for it. It was only when he reached the old section, the part of the cemetery most visitors avoided without realizing why, that the air changed. Not colder, he would have accepted cold, but heavier, like the pressure shift before a storm, the kind that made your ears feel full and your thoughts slow. The trees here were older, their branches tangled in a way that blocked the sky, and the headstones leaned at angles that suggested long, patient surrender rather than collapse. Elijah slowed without meaning to, his flashlight beam catching on weathered symbols he'd stopped trying to identify, the kind of carvings that predated the neat logic of dates and names, and instead spoke in curves and marks that felt less like writing and more like instructions. The sound drifted across the path, not a voice, not exactly. Elijah stopped, every muscle tightening as his brain scrambled for something ordinary to pin it on. Wind through leaves, an animal shifting in the brush, the echo of traffic from miles away, but this sound had rhythm, a soft, uneven cadence that rose and fell like breath, trying to remember how to be breath. He turned slowly, flashlight slicing through darkness, illuminating nothing but stone and shadow, his pulse loud in his ears, his mind already rehearsing the rational explanation he would tell himself later, when the sound resolved into something he could name. Then he saw movement near the main gate. At first, it was just a blur, a thickening of shadow where there shouldn't have been one. a smudge against the night that didn't quite line up with the angle of the moon. Elijah squinted, took a step forward, and felt a strange, electric prickle run up his legs, as if the ground beneath his boots had decided, abruptly, that it no longer recognized him. He lifted the flashlight higher, and that was when the blur separated into shapes, figures, not rushing, not floating in the way movies taught people to expect. They moved slowly, deliberately, a loose procession slipping through the closed iron gate as if it were nothing more than a suggestion. Their feet, or what should have been their feet, hovering inches above the gravel without disturbing it. There were dozens of them, maybe more, their forms indistinct, edges blurred like a photograph taken with shaking hands, but their direction was unmistakable, all of them moving inward, deeper into the cemetery, following a path that existed only for them. Elijah's mouth went dry. He told himself it was exhaustion, that the long hours and the thin sleep were finally playing tricks on him, that this was what happened when your brain filled in gaps with nonsense because it didn't like uncertainty. But even as the words formed in his mind, his body refused to believe them. His hand drifted to his phone, fingers fumbling as he pulled it free, the screen lighting up his face in a harsh, artificial glow that made the figures seem to recoil just slightly, as if light was an inconvenience rather than a threat. No signal. He frowned, tapped the screen, turned in a slow circle, lifting the phone higher, lower, searching for even the faintest bar, but the display remained stubbornly blank, a small, silent rectangle that offered nothing. His flashlight flickered, once, twice, and steadied again, but the brief stutter was enough to send a spike of panic through his chest that he swallowed down with effort. "Get a grip," he muttered, the sound of his own voice startlingly loud in the open air. The figures continued past the gate, drifting between the headstones, their number growing as more emerged from the darkness beyond the fence, joining the line with quiet inevitability. Elijah noticed then that they weren't touching the ground at all, not even lightly, that their movement didn't stir leaves or grass, didn't disturb the careful disarray of the old section, and that realization settled in his gut with an uncomfortable finality. He reached into his jacket and pulled out the small compass he kept clipped to his belt, a habit left over from hiking trips he barely took anymore, and watched as the needle spun wildly, unable to decide on a direction, trembling as if the very concept of north had become offensive. The whispering started. It wasn't coming from the figures, not directly. It seemed to seep out of the ground itself, a low, overlapping murmur that pressed against his ears and slid under his thoughts, syllables slipping just out of focus, familiar enough to tease recognition but distorted enough to resist it. Elijah tried to step back, to put distance between himself and whatever this was, but his boots felt heavier with each movement, as if the gravel had turned to wet cement, clinging and resistant. His heart hammered harder now, breath shallow, every instinct screaming at him to run, to leave, to abandon rationality along with the flashlight and the shed and the tidy explanations he'd built his life around. But his legs refused to cooperate. The procession passed closer, and as they did, Elijah caught flashes of detail, a sleeve that looked like wool, thick and old, a hint of brass catching the moonlight, the suggestion of faces that never quite resolved into features. One of them turned its head, just slightly, and for a moment, Elijah had the unbearable sensation of being recognized, of being counted. The whispering grew louder, the compass needle spun faster, and beneath it all, from somewhere deep in the cemetery, came the sound of something shifting, something vast and patient, as if the earth itself had been disturbed from a sleep it had no intention of ending quietly. Elijah stood frozen, caught between disbelief and a terror he had no framework for, watching the dead walk past him without looking back, and understood, with a clarity that made his stomach drop, that whatever rules he thought governed this place had just been suspended, and that the night was no longer interested in pretending otherwise. Elijah did not remember deciding to follow them. Later, when memory tried to assemble the night into something linear and survivable, there would be a blank space here, a soft tear in the fabric of cause and effect where choice should have lived. What he remembered instead was the sensation of motion returning to his legs without his permission, the gravel yielding beneath his boots as if reluctantly releasing him, the whispering easing just enough to let his thoughts resurface. Thin and frightened, clinging to the idea that movement, any movement, was better than standing still in a place where the dead had begun to walk with purpose. The procession had already drifted deeper into the old section by the time he managed his first step. Their shapes thinned and thickened with distance, sometimes appearing as nothing more than darker seams in the night, sometimes resolving into figures so close he felt he could reach out and brush his hand through them, though something deep in his chest recoiled at the idea, instinct screaming that touch would be an invitation he could not revoke. He followed at a distance that felt safe but meaningless. The beam of his flashlight kept low, skimming the ground, illuminating roots and broken stones rather than faces. The air smelled different here. Not rot, and he would have recognized rot, but something older, drier, like dust trapped between the pages of a book no one remembered how to read. With every step, Elijah became more aware of the ground beneath him, the way it dipped and rose in subtle defiance of the path's suggestion, the way his boots sank just a little too deep into soil that should have been firm after weeks without rain. He told himself this was geology, erosion, the natural settling of an old place. But the whispering returned with each rational thought, undermining it, threading doubt through certainty until he stopped trying to explain and simply moved. The procession thinned as it approached the heart of the old cemetery, figures peeling away one by one, drifting toward unmarked plots, slipping between headstones that bore no legible names, until only a handful remained, their direction converging toward a darker mass ahead. Elijah followed their gaze and felt his breath catch. The oak tree had always been there. It was impossible to work the cemetery and not know it, a massive thing with a trunk thick enough that 3 people could not have wrapped their arms around it, its branches stretching outward like a sheltering canopy over a cluster of the oldest graves. Elijah had leaned against it on slow afternoons, eaten lunches in its shade, watched storms break against it and lose, the oak standing unmoved, patient, a landmark as reliable as the fence or the bell tower. Now, it was broken. One of its great limbs lay split and twisted across a stone tomb, the exposed wood pale and raw against the darkness, fibers torn apart in a way that spoke not of gradual decay but of sudden, violent force. Smaller branches littered the ground like discarded bones, leaves crushed into the soil, and the smell hit him then, sharp and green and wrong, the scent of living wood torn open where it should not have been. Elijah slowed, heart pounding, his flashlight beam creeping upward along the fallen limb, tracing the path of destruction until it settled on the tomb beneath. The stone was old, older than the cemetery records went back, its surface carved with symbols instead of names, the same looping marks Elijah had noticed before but never questioned. The fallen branch had cracked the lid, shifting it just enough to expose a dark gap where there should have been none, and from that gap, something glimmered faintly in the beam of his light, a charm, or a seal. Elijah did not have the language for it, only the visceral certainty that whatever it was did not belong in the open air. It lay half buried in disturbed soil, a flat piece of stone etched with the same symbols as the tomb, its edges worn smooth by time or hands or both. As he stepped closer, the whispering intensified, no longer diffuse but directional, pulling his attention toward the object with a pressure that made his temples ache. He crouched to spite himself. The rational part of his mind screamed that this was a mistake, that touching anything connected to a broken tomb at the center of a procession of the dead was a spectacularly bad idea. But another thought, quieter and more insidious, pressed in beneath it. If this was the source, if this was what had drawn them, then understanding it might be the only way to stop whatever was happening. He reached out, fingers hovering inches above the stone, and felt a faint vibration, like the hum of a distant engine, traveling up his arm. The moment his skin made contact, the night shifted. The whispering snapped into coherence, no longer a tangle of overlapping sounds, but a single, layered voice that spoke in a cadence too old for English, syllables rolling and folding in on themselves, carrying intent rather than meaning. The ground beneath Elijah's knees went cold, a chill seeping through denim and bone, and his grip tightened reflexively on the charm as images flooded his mind, marching boots sinking into mud, the metallic tang of fear. the weight of a coat heavy with rain and history. He gasped, jerking his hand back. The charm slipped from his fingers and struck the stone with a dull, resonant clack that echoed far louder than it should have. The sound rippled outward, and the remaining figures in the procession stopped all at once, their indistinct heads turning toward him in unison. Elijah scrambled to his feet, heart hammering, flashlight swinging wildly as he backed away from the tomb, from the oak, from the feeling that he had just crossed a line he hadn't known existed. That was when he saw the uniform. It was not fully formed at first, just a suggestion of structure within the shadow, the outline of a coat that did not belong to any living fashion, its cut severe, its fabric thick and worn. As the figure stepped forward, details resolved: the dull gleam of brass buttons, the stiff collar, the way the coat hung heavy on a frame that seemed carved rather than grown. The whispering deepened, took on a rhythm that matched the figure's movement, and Elijah realized with a jolt that it was not coming from the ground anymore. It was coming from him. The figure's face remained indistinct, features blurred as if viewed through water, but its presence was undeniable, radiating a cold authority that pressed against Elijah's chest and made it difficult to breathe. He tried to step back and found his foot caught, not on a root or a stone, but on something that felt like resistance itself, an unseen pressure holding him in place. He pulled harder. Nothing. Panic surged, hot and immediate, and he yanked again, twisting, trying to break free. But the ground clung to him now, invisible hands wrapping around his ankles, his calves creeping upward with deliberate patience. The charm lay forgotten near the tomb, its symbols faintly luminous in the corner of his vision, and Elijah understood, dimly, that whatever balance it had maintained had been disrupted, that the oak's fall had not been an accident, and that his touch had been an invitation. The figure raised one gloved hand. The whispering stopped. In its place came a sound like fabric shifting against fabric, the soft rasp of old leather, and beneath it, a low murmur that vibrated through Elijah's bones rather than his ears. He could not understand the words, but the intent was unmistakable. Accusation, recognition, the satisfaction of a sentry whose watch had finally been answered. Elijah's breath came in short, ragged bursts. He thought of the shed, the gate, the phone with its useless blank screen, the comfortable lie of skepticism he had wrapped around himself like armor, and felt it crumble under the weight of what stood before him. The world had narrowed to this moment, this place where the dead had gathered not to wander, but to witness. The figure took another step closer. The oak creaked overhead, its broken limb shifting slightly, and the charm on the ground pulsed once, a faint, warning glow that went unnoticed by everyone except Elijah. He locked his gaze on it, on the possibility, however slim that it was, not too late, that something could still be done, even as the unseen grip around his legs tightened, rooting him to the earth like a grave in waiting. The night held its breath, and somewhere deep beneath the cemetery, something older than names, older than borders, stirred in response. The first thing Elijah lost was his sense of time. It slipped away so quietly that he did not notice its absence until later, when memory tried to reconstruct the sequence of moments and found nothing solid to anchor them to. There was no before and after now, only the pressure of the ground gripping his legs, the cold authority radiating from the figure in the old coat, and the unnerving certainty that whatever stood before him had been waiting far longer than a single lifetime for this interruption. The figure moved again, slow and deliberate, each step measured as if distance itself were a formality. Elijah felt the vibration of its approach through the soil before he saw it, a subtle tremor that traveled upward through his trapped legs and settled in his chest like a second, heavier heartbeat. The whispering returned, not as sound but as sensation, a crawl along the inside of his skull that carried meaning without language, images pressing forward whether he invited them or not. Mud, endless, sucking mud that clung to boots and pulled at calves, with the same patient insistence now gripping him, the smell of damp wool and iron, the weight of exhaustion so deep it blurred pain into something distant and manageable. Elijah squeezed his eyes shut, trying to block it out, but the images sharpened instead, growing clearer with each attempt to resist, until he understood the resistance was not part of whatever ritual this was. The figure stopped a few feet away. Up close, the uniform was unmistakable. The cut was wrong for any modern reenactment, the fabric too thick, the seams hand-finished in a way that spoke of necessity rather than decoration. The coat hung heavy on a body that did not sway with breath, its buttons dull with age but meticulously fastened, as if undone fastenings were a failure this thing could not tolerate. Elijah's gaze drifted upward despite himself, searching for a face, for eyes, for anything human he could latch onto. There was nothing, not emptiness, exactly, but a refusal of detail, as if the space where a face should have been had been deliberately erased. The longer he looked, the more his vision slid away, unable to focus, his mind skittering off the surface like a dropped stone on ice. Panic flared again, sharp and acidic, and he twisted his torso, trying to wrench free of the unseen force holding him. The ground responded. It tightened. Elijah cried out as pressure wrapped around his thighs and hips, an invisible embrace that pulled him downward, inch by inch, his boots sinking deeper into soil that now felt less like earth and more like a living thing adjusting its grip. He clawed at the ground with his hands, fingers scraping against gravel and roots, nails tearing. But the resistance was absolute, unyielding, as if the cemetery itself had decided to claim him as part of its inventory. The figure raised its hand again. This time, the whispering resolved into sound, not English, not any language Elijah recognized. The words carried the cadence of command, clipped and precise, syllables falling into place with the weight of orders given and obeyed without question. The sound vibrated through him, bypassing his ears entirely, and with it came a crushing awareness of scrutiny, of being measured against a standard he did not understand and could not meet. "You are here," the voice seemed to say without saying. "You have been counted." Elijah shook his head violently, a reflexive denial that felt childish even as he did it. "I didn't mean to," he gasped, the words tumbling out thin and useless, his breath fogging in front of his face. "I didn't know. I didn't dare." The figure did not react. It simply stood there, watching, or rather, existing in a way that made watching irrelevant while the ground continued its slow reclamation. Elijah's knees disappeared beneath the surface, the cold creeping higher, numbing skin and muscle until sensation dulled into an abstract awareness of loss. His thoughts scattered, snagging on half-formed memories of ordinary things, the warmth of the caretaker's shed, the hum of the old radio he kept on during night shifts, the smug comfort of disbelief. A mistake. He saw it now with painful clarity. Skepticism had not protected him. It had blinded him. He had mistaken ignorance for safety, had walked into a place that operated on rules older and stricter than anything he had been taught, and now those rules were being enforced with impartial precision. The charm pulsed again, its faint glow cut through the darkness near the cracked tomb, a steady, rhythmic light that seemed almost insistent. Elijah locked onto it with desperate focus, his mind latching onto the possibility like a drowning man grabbing driftwood. He did not know what the charm was or how it worked, only that it had been there before the oak fell, before the procession began, before the figure in the coat had stepped forward to reclaim its authority, before he could think better of it. He lunged. The movement was clumsy and half-finished, his upper body pitching forward while his lower half remained trapped, but it was enough. His fingers brushed the stone, then closed around it, the symbols biting into his palm with a sharp, searing pain that stole his breath. The whispering spiked, rising into a dissonant chorus that set his teeth on edge, and the figure reacted for the first time. It recoiled, not dramatically, not with fear, but with something like surprise, its posture shifting just enough to break the illusion of inevitability. The ground's grip faltered, loosening for a heartbeat that Elijah seized without hesitation. He yanked upward, muscles screaming in protest, and felt himself tear free with a wet, sucking sound that echoed obscenely loud in the stillness. He stumbled backward, clutching the charm to his chest, breath ragged, legs trembling as sensation rushed back in painful waves. The figure advanced a step, then stopped, an invisible barrier seeming to form between it and the glowing stone. The whispering, fractured, overlapping voices clashing and canceling each other out. And beneath it all, a deeper sound emerged, a low, resonant hum that felt like the prelude to something vast and irreversible. The oak groaned overhead. The broken limb shifted again, cracking further, and Elijah had the sudden, terrifying realization that the tree's fall had not been random, that it had been a calculated breach, a way in. The charm in his hand grew warmer, its symbols burning brighter, and with that warmth came understanding, not knowledge, but instinct. This place was not a resting ground. It was a threshold, and the figure in the old coat was not a ghost. It was a watcher. The hum deepened, the ground vibrating underfoot, and from the corner of his vision, Elijah saw movement beyond the trees, a flicker of light approaching through the darkness, accompanied by a sound that did not belong to the cemetery's usual vocabulary, a soft, rhythmic chanting that cut through the chaos with steady purpose. The figure turned its attention toward the sound. For the first time since the procession began, the night seemed to hesitate, caught between forces older and stronger than anything Elijah had ever believed in. He staggered back another step, clutching the charm, knowing with bone-deep certainty that whatever was coming was his last chance to leave this place with anything resembling a life. The chanting reached him before the source did. It slipped between the trees, in steady intervals, a low, deliberate cadence that seemed to press outward rather than travel, filling space instead of crossing it. And with each measured phrase, the chaotic whispering around Elijah thinned, drawn back as if by an invisible tide. He stood frozen, charm clenched in his aching hand, watching as a warm, amber light began to glow among the trunks at the far edge of the old section, distinct from the moonlight in a way that made his eyes sting. It was not bright. That was the unsettling part. The light did not cut through the darkness or banish it. It rested within it, soft and contained, like a held breath. As it drew closer, Elijah made out the figure, carrying it an elderly woman wrapped in layered fabric that moved with her rather than against her. A small lantern cradled in both hands. Her hair was pulled back tight and streaked with white. Her face lined deeply enough to suggest decades of nights like this one. Nights spent awake while others slept and trusted that the world would remain stable until morning. She did not look surprised to see him. Her gaze flicked briefly to Elijah, then past him, settling on the figure in the old coat with an expression that was neither fear nor anger, but weary recognition. The chanting stopped as she came to a halt at the edge of the broken oak's shadow, the silence that followed thick and expectant, as if the cemetery itself were listening. "You shouldn't be holding that," she said, her voice quiet but unyielding, carrying easily across the distance between them. Elijah swallowed, his throat dry. "It was on the ground," he managed, the words sounding inadequate even to his own ears. "The tree it fell. I didn't know." "I know," she interrupted gently. "You never do." She stepped closer, and the lantern's light brushed against the figure in the coat. It did not recoil this time. Instead, the air around it seemed to tighten, the whispering compressing into a low, angry murmur that made Elijah's teeth ache. The woman set the lantern down on a flat stone near the cracked tomb, its glow steady and unwavering, then straightened, her shoulders squaring as she began to speak again, her words falling into a rhythm that felt older than prayer. The language was unfamiliar, each syllable deliberate, shaped with care. Elijah felt the charm in his hand respond immediately, heat flaring, symbols glowing brighter in time with her voice. The ground beneath his feet vibrated, not violently but insistently, as if something buried deep below was shifting position, reminded of its place. The figure in the old coat took a step forward. The woman raised one hand, palm out, and did not break cadence. The light intensified just enough to cast the figure's outline sharply against the darkness, and for the first time, Elijah saw more than a refusal of detail. Beneath the coat's rigid structure, there was emptiness where a body should have been, a hollow presence shaped by duty rather than flesh. The realization sent a cold ripple through him. This was not a man who had died and lingered, but something constructed, appointed, bound to function long after the context that created it had eroded. "A watcher," the woman said, switching languages without pause, her tone edged with something like reprimand. "A keeper set where grief and blood soaked deep enough to stain the ground. You were never meant to be worshipped. The murmur swelled, rising into a sound like distant thunder, and the charm in Elijah's hand flared painfully hot. He cried out, instinctively loosening his grip, and the woman's eyes snapped back to him. She moved with surprising speed, crossing the distance between them in a few swift steps and closing his fingers around the stone again with practiced firmness. "Don't drop it," she said sharply. "It's the only reason you're still standing." Her touch grounded him, the panic receding just enough for his thoughts to coalesce. "What is it?" he asked, voice shaking. "What did I do?" She glanced back at the figure, then at the broken oak, her expression tightening. "You didn't do anything," she said. "Not intentionally. The tree fell because the seal weakened. Age does that. Time forgets why things were put in place, and people forget to remember." She nodded toward the charm. "That stone was never meant to be exposed. It keeps the watcher oriented." The figure shifted again, its presence pressing outward, testing the boundaries the woman's words were weaving back into place. The lantern flickered, not in danger, but in response, as if acknowledging strain. The woman resumed her chanting, louder now, the rhythm sharpening, and the cemetery answered. The ground shuddered. Headstones rattled softly, soil settling, and the whispering fractured into disjointed echoes that dissolved as quickly as they formed. The procession Elijah had followed earlier reappeared at the edge of his vision, their shapes thinning, fading, drawn backward toward the spaces they'd emerged from, their purpose interrupted, deferred. The figure in the old coat resisted. It straightened, looming, the hollow beneath the uniform pulling inward as if gathering force. The temperature dropped sharply, frost blooming along the edges of the fallen oak's exposed wood, and Elijah felt the charm vibrate violently in his grasp, a warning that reverberated through his bones. The woman's voice did not waver. She reached into her robe and withdrew a small bundle, unwrapping it to reveal a strip of fabric marked with symbols similar to those on the charm, inked, dark, and deliberate. She stepped forward, closer than Elijah would have thought possible, and placed the strip against the figure's chest. There was a sound like fabric tearing. The figure staggered back, its outline distorting, the uniform sagging, as if suddenly too heavy for whatever held it upright. The murmur erupted into a raw, animal sound that scraped at Elijah's nerves, but the woman held her ground, pressing the marked fabric firmly into place and speaking a final, forceful phrase that seemed to slam into the night and lock. The hum beneath the cemetery subsided. The frost melted. The figure collapsed inward, not falling so much as folding, its presence compressing until it was nothing more than a dark imprint against the air, then nothing at all. The whispering ceased entirely, leaving behind a silence so complete it rang. Elijah sagged, knees buckling, the charm finally cooling in his hand. The woman exhaled slowly, the tension draining from her posture as she retrieved the lantern and turned to face him. "It's done," she said, though her eyes lingered on the broken oak with something like regret. For now, Elijah echoed faintly. She studied him for a long moment, then nodded once. "You'll live," she said, "but you won't forget. The ground doesn't allow that." As if in response, the first hint of dawn brushed the sky, a pale promise that felt fragile after the night they had endured. The woman began to gather her things, moving with the efficiency of someone who knew better than to linger. Elijah looked at the charm in his hand, then back at the oak, the tomb, the place where the watcher had stood. "What happens to me?" he asked quietly. She paused, lantern held low, and met his gaze. "You go home," she said, "and you stop believing the world is smaller than it is." She turned and walked back into the trees, the lantern's light dimming until it was indistinguishable from the approaching dawn. Elijah was left alone in the old section, the cemetery settling around him, the broken oak a scar that would need time and care to heal, and the uneasy knowledge that some shifts never truly ended. The unsaleable penthouse. The elevator rose too smoothly. Evelyn Harper noticed that before she noticed anything else, the absence of vibration. The way the ascent felt less like movement and more like being quietly lifted out of the city's reach. Soft jazz spilled from hidden speakers, the kind curated to suggest refinement without personality, and the brushed metal walls reflected her image back at her in fragments. camera bag over one shoulder, coat buttoned wrong, eyes alert in the way they always were when she stepped into a space someone wanted her to approve of. She pressed 15. The button lit up without resistance. Evelyn had built her reputation dismantling fear. Luxury condos, abandoned hotels, half-finished developments, places the internet loved to label cursed. She specialized in staying the night, documenting everything, and leaving with calm explanations that sold better than terror ever did. Mold sounded like whispers. Old pipes moaned. Structural stress knocked when the temperature shifted. Mystery, she told her audience, was just ignorance dressed dramatically. The penthouse doors opened directly into glass. Floor-to-ceiling windows wrapped around the space, revealing the city laid out below in sharp, obedient lines. Everything inside was deliberate. Stone counters without fingerprints. Furniture chosen more for symmetry than comfort. Air chilled to the exact temperature luxury demanded. The place smelled new in a way that felt almost aggressive, like it was trying too hard to convince her it had no past. She stepped inside. The elevator doors slid shut behind her with a soft, decisive sound. Top floor, Evelyn murmured into her recorder. Voice low, professional, brand new build, 15 stories, 0 buyers. She crossed toward the windows, heels clicking softly against the floor, and looked down. Cars moved like veins of light far below, sound barely reaching this height. It felt sealed off from consequence, from history. That was usually where the story ended. She unpacked slowly, filming a walkthrough while daylight still clung to the sky. Everything photographed beautifully, too beautifully. By the time evening arrived, the penthouse felt staged for someone who never showed up. Evelyn poured a glass of wine, cued a playlist jazz again, preloaded into the system and texted Daniel. "They're paying me to stay here," she wrote. "You should see this place." She didn't mention the rumors the developer had asked her to address. The first sound came after dark. It slipped between notes of music, so faint she almost mistook it for her own breathing. Evelyn paused, glass hovering near her lips. Listening, the sound came again. 3 slow knocks, evenly spaced. Not loud enough to demand attention, but too deliberate to ignore. She turned toward the front door. The hallway beyond it was dim. Lights recessed low, shadows stretching long and undisturbed. Evelyn frowned, irritation rising before fear ever could. She muted the music and walked over, placing her ear near the door. A sound exhaled back at her. Not speech, not quite pain, just breath forced through something tight. Evelyn opened the door. The hallway was empty. She stepped out, scanning left and right. No movement, no sound. The air was cooler here, strangely still, as if the building were holding itself rigid. She returned inside and locked the door, telling herself what she had told hundreds of viewers before. New buildings settle. Sound travels vertically. Fear fills silence. She pulled up the security feed on her phone anyway. The hallway camera showed nothing. She finished her wine, convinced herself the moment had passed. It hadn't. The knocking returned later. Closer. Heavier. 3 knocks. A pause. Then the low, strained breathing again, directly on the other side of the door. Evelyn stood frozen, phone raised, heart rate climbing despite her efforts to remain detached. The camera feed still showed an empty hall. When morning came, she reviewed footage from the previous day, skimming absent-mindedly until the elevator camera caught her eye. She slowed the playback. There she was, stepping into the penthouse. Behind her reflection, something else lingered, not stepping out, not entering, just stretched across the metal wall, elongated and indistinct, as though pulled upward by a force that never let go. Evelyn stared at the screen until the coffee in her mug went cold, 15 floors above ground. Something had never left. Daniel Reed arrived just before sunset, carrying the outside world with him in small, ordinary details, the smell of rain drying on concrete, the faint chill of wind trapped in his coat, the soft exhaustion of a workday that had unfolded exactly as expected. Evelyn watched from the kitchen island as the elevator doors opened directly into the penthouse, and he stepped out, pausing instinctively as the space revealed itself. "Okay," he said slowly, eyes tracing the glass walls and the city beyond them. I see why they're nervous about this one. Evelyn smiled, already lifting her camera. Nervous sells. Silence doesn't. Daniel laughed, the sound grounding in a way the jazz playlist never quite managed. He set his bag down and walked toward the windows, hands in his pockets, peering out over the drop. From up here, the city looked unreal, too distant to feel dangerous, too orderly to feel alive. Feels like the building forgot it's part of the city, he said. Like it's hovering. That's just height, Evelyn replied automatically. People romanticize it. Daniel nodded, but didn't step back right away. They spent the evening the way they always did when Evelyn was reviewing a place takeout, eaten standing up, idle conversations circling the same few safe topics, or occasionally drifting into work mode to point out finishes or design choices that would photograph well. Daniel listened, half interested, half distracted, his attention slipping toward the balcony more often than Evelyn liked. "You're doing that thing," she said eventually. "What thing?" Staring like you're waiting for the building to talk back. Daniel smiled thinly. "It's quiet up here. Too quiet." The comment lingered longer than it should have. When night fully settled, the penthouse seemed to change character. The jazz played on, but the sound felt stretched, notes hanging just a fraction too long before resolving. The glass walls reflected their movements back at them in duplicate, making the space feel crowded despite its size. Evelyn dismissed the unease as fatigue and followed Daniel to bed, city lights painting slow patterns across the ceiling. She slept. Daniel did not. Sometime after midnight, Evelyn surfaced from a shallow dream with the sense that something was missing. The bed felt lighter, cooler on one side. She turned, eyes still heavy, expecting to see Daniel in the bathroom or reaching for water. The balcony door stood open. Cold air slid across her skin, deliberate and directional, carrying with it the distant roar of traffic far below and something else, a sound so faint it barely qualified as noise at all. Breathing. Evelyn sat up fully, pulse snapping awake. "Daniel?" she called, already swinging her legs over the side of the bed. She crossed the penthouse quickly, bare feet whispering against the floor, and stepped onto the balcony just as a gust of wind surged upward, tugging at her clothes. Daniel stood at the railing, his silhouette framed against the city, posture slack, shoulders pitched forward as though listening intently to something beyond the edge. "Daniel," she said again, sharper now. He didn't turn. Instead, he leaned closer to the railing, fingers tightening around the cold metal, knuckles whitening. His eyes were open but unfocused, reflecting light without comprehension. His mouth moved slightly, shaping breath into something uneven and strained. Evelyn grabbed him, her hands fisted into the back of his shirt, and she pulled hard, dragging him away from the edge with a startled cry tearing from his throat. Daniel stumbled, nearly falling, and collapsed against her, chest heaving, eyes wide, with sudden awareness. What are you doing?" he gasped. "You were about to fall," Evelyn said, her voice shaking despite her effort to steady it. "You were leaning over." Daniel blinked, confusion giving way to something darker. "No," he said slowly. I was helping. The word landed badly. She guided him back inside and slammed the balcony door shut, locking it with unnecessary force. The sound echoed too loudly, bouncing off glass and steel. Evelyn wrapped a blanket around Daniel's shoulders and steered him to the couch, her own hands trembling now that the immediate danger had passed. "What do you mean, helping?" she asked. Daniel stared at the floor for a long moment. "I thought someone was out there," he said finally. "In the building. I was dreaming, but it felt organized, like it wasn't random." He rubbed his upper back unconsciously. Something was pulling me forward. Not pushing, pulling, like it couldn't reach the edge on its own. The air in the penthouse felt heavier. Evelyn's phone buzzed on the table between them. She didn't want to look at it. That reluctance alone told her everything she needed to know. When she picked it up, the security app was already open, a notification pulsing softly at the top of the screen. "Motion detected. Elevator level 15. She turned the phone toward Daniel so he could see. The live feed showed the elevator car. Empty. Doors sliding open with mechanical indifference. The camera angle shifted slightly, as if tracking movement just out of frame. The image warped, metal stretching unnaturally, and for a brief, nauseating instant, something appeared pressed flat against the back wall, elongated upward, its shape distorted as though gravity worked differently for it. Then the doors closed. The feed stabilized. Daniel swallowed hard. "That's not a glitch," he said quietly. Evelyn felt the last of her practiced detachment crack. "No," she agreed. "It's not." And outside, 15 floors below, the city continued its steady pulse, unaware that something inside the building was still reaching outward, rehearsing the same unfinished motion over and over, waiting for a body warm enough to respond. Evelyn did not sleep after Daniel left. She watched the elevator doors close behind him the next morning with a concentration that bordered on superstition, listening until the soft hum of the car faded downward through the building's spine. Only then did she lock the penthouse door and stand still, letting the silence settle around her like dust. The jazz playlist remained untouched. Music felt dishonest now, too decorative for a place that had begun to insist on being heard. She told herself she was overreacting. She told herself this was still a job. But the building seemed to respond to her thoughts, the low mechanical murmur deepening as if amused by the attempt. Pipes shifted somewhere beneath the floor. The vents sighed, not rhythmically, but in uneven intervals, like breath interrupted by pain. Evelyn opened her laptop. She started where she always did: permits, inspection logs, architectural filings. Everything was pristine, too pristine. Each document aligned perfectly with the next timelines, smoothing over what should have been messier realities. For a project this large, the absence of complications felt intentional. She widened the scope: older municipal archives, labor records, emergency response call logs filtered by district and date. Her fingers moved quickly, practiced, but her mind lagged behind, distracted by the sensation that something in the penthouse was adjusting itself as she searched, listening for recognition. The first inconsistency appeared quietly: a construction delay during early vertical development, 3 days marked as structural assessment. No incident reports attached. No follow-up inspections listed. The project resumed, as if nothing had happened. Evelyn frowned and drilled deeper. Citywide accident reports from the same week. Most were routine. One wasn't. Unidentified male. Fall from height. Night shift. Location. Pending verification. Status: body not recovered. Her pulse quickened. She searched local news archives next, pages buried under years of newer headlines. The article was short, written with the careful vagueness reserved for stories someone wanted forgotten. A construction worker had fallen during late-night work at a downtown high-rise. Emergency services responded. Work was temporarily suspended. The article ended there, trailing off without resolution, without names, without consequences. Evelyn leaned back, staring at the screen. 15 floors. She closed the laptop and stood, drawn toward the wall separating the living space from the elevator shaft. Up close, the imperfections she had dismissed earlier sharpened into certainty. The paint here absorbed light differently. The surface felt denser beneath her knuckles when she rapped it gently, the sound dull and unwilling to travel. She pressed her palm flat against the wall. A vibration answered. Not continuous, irregular. 3 muted impacts from somewhere deep inside the structure, followed by a long, strained exhale that seemed to slide through the concrete rather than bounce off it. Evelyn recoiled, heart slamming against her ribs, and backed away until she hit the kitchen island. "This isn't happening," she whispered. The wall responded with another tremor, firmer this time, as if encouraged by being acknowledged. Her phone buzzed on the counter. An email notification glowed on the screen. Subject: just checking in. The sender was the developer, polite, casual, unreadable. They thanked her again for her stay, asked if everything was comfortable, and reminded her that unfinished service areas were restricted for safety reasons. Evelyn stared at the message, a cold realization settling in her chest. They knew. She hadn't contacted them. She hadn't asked questions publicly, and yet the building seemed to tighten around her, the air cooling by degrees, the distant hum deepening like a warning tone. That afternoon, She ignored the email and went downstairs. The lower levels felt different, not abandoned, but paused, as if construction had stopped mid-breath. Temporary barriers were easy to slip past, warning signs more symbolic than functional. Lights flickered on as she entered spaces that smelled of dust and damp concrete, the echo of her footsteps returning slightly out of sync, as though the building struggled to keep up. She followed the sound. It was clearer here, no longer a vague vibration, but a persistent, muffled impact that guided her through unfinished corridors toward the building's core. The air grew colder as she descended, carrying a metallic tang that caught at the back of her throat. She stopped in front of a raw concrete wall. No paint, no insulation, just surface. The sound came again. 3 impacts, a pause, then breath ragged, exhausted, endless. Evelyn pressed her ear to the wall despite herself. The sensation that followed was not auditory. It was emotional. Desperation flooded her chest, so sudden and intense it stole her breath. Images rose, unbidden hands scraping against wet concrete, fingers slipping, lungs burning as air thinned and thickened at the same time. A scream tried to form and failed, swallowed by the structure closing in. Evelyn staggered back, gasping, eyes stinging. "I know," she whispered, the words breaking free before she could stop them. "I know what they did." The impacts grew frantic. Not louder, but closer together, scraping now rather than striking, a futile attempt to complete a motion that had never finished. The building seemed to shudder in response, a subtle adjustment of mass and pressure that made Evelyn's knees weaken. She didn't need more proof. The penthouse wasn't unsaleable because it was haunted. It was unsaleable because it was complicit. Somewhere between the 15th floor and the foundation, a man had been erased, buried not by accident, but by decision. Concrete had been poured while he was still there, sealing him into the structure so the project could continue on schedule, profits uninterrupted. The building had grown around him, layer by layer, carrying his final moment upward like a fault line no amount of luxury could conceal. Evelyn backed away from the wall, the sound fading but never fully stopping, and understood with chilling clarity that silence here was not peace. It was pressure, and pressure, she knew, always sought release. Evelyn waited until night to start recording. Daylight softened things. It made the penthouse feel forgivable, even elegant, as if the city below could wash away whatever pressure lingered in the walls. Night, on the other hand, stripped the space down to its essentials: glass, steel, concrete, and the quiet insistence of something that had been waiting far longer than she had been listening. She set her camera on a tripod facing the living area, framing the windows so the city lights formed a grid behind her like an exposed circuit board. She checked the audio levels twice. No jazz, no background music. If she was going to tell this story, it would be without adornment. The red recording light blinked on. "My name is Evelyn Harper," she began, voice steady in a way she didn't entirely feel. "I review properties. I'm currently staying in a penthouse on the 15th floor of a new development that, according to its owners, has no reason to be empty." The building answered her immediately, not with sound, but with sensation. A faint vibration rippled through the floor, subtle enough that she might have missed it if she hadn't been waiting for it. Evelyn continued, describing the knocking, the breathing, the elevator footage. As she spoke, the air cooled in small, measurable increments, the glass walls fogging faintly despite the controlled temperature. She shifted her weight, grounding herself, and kept going. "I found records," she said. "A construction worker fell during night work. No body recovered, no lawsuit filed, no explanation." The vibration grew stronger. Somewhere behind the wall, near the elevator shaft, a dull impact sounded one strike, then another, each one slow, deliberate, synchronized with her words. Evelyn swallowed, but did not stop speaking. "He didn't leave," she said. "He couldn't." The lights flickered, just once. Her pulse spiked, but the camera remained steady, its unblinking lens a witness she clung to. Evelyn stood and walked toward the wall, the camera following her on its fixed axis. The sound intensified as she approached, no longer muffled but insistent, scraping now, as though something inside the concrete had realized it was finally being acknowledged. "Listen," she said softly, angling the microphone closer. The sound bled into the recording, rhythmic, desperate, unmistakably human in its effort. Beneath it, the strained exhale threaded through the wall like a plea that had been forced to repeat itself until it lost language. The building shuddered. Not violently, but enough to set the window frames trembling, enough to send a thin crack spidering across the surface of the wall at eye level. Evelyn froze, breath caught, watching as the fracture widened with agonizing slowness, dust sifting down like fine ash. Something pale showed through the gap, not exposed rebar, not wiring, a shape. The crack spread further, concrete crumbling inward, revealing a section of foundation poured too thick, too carelessly. Within it, barely discernible but unmistakable once seen, was the suggestion of a human form, an impression rather than a body, arms raised as if bracing, spine curved in a posture of strain that had never resolved. Evelyn staggered back, heart hammering. The sound from inside the wall surged, scraping frantic now, vibrating through the room with a force that rattled glass and made the camera shake on its tripod. Alarms wailed somewhere deep in the building, distant and confused, as systems struggled to respond to something they were never designed to detect. Evelyn grabbed her phone and ran. The hallway outside the penthouse was chaos, lights flashing, emergency tones echoing off polished surfaces. She didn't stop until she reached the stairwell, taking the steps two at a time as the building groaned around her, the sound of cracking concrete following, like a pursuing memory. By the time she reached the street, police sirens were already approaching, their distant wail cutting through the city's hum. Evelyn stood on the sidewalk, shaking, phone clutched to her chest, and watched as lights flared across the building's glass facade, illuminating it from the outside for the first time. From this angle, she could see it. A subtle distortion along the 15th floor, a shadow that didn't align with the rest of the structure, as if something inside was still pressing outward, rehearsing the same unfinished motion over and over. The footage went live an hour later. By morning, the developer's website was gone. By evening, the building was cordoned off, inspectors swarming its base with clipboards and expressions that tried very hard not to look like fear. Official statements blamed structural defects, unforeseen complications, anomalies under investigation. No one said the word body. Evelyn watched the coverage from a hotel room across town, the sound muted, her own recording replaying silently on her laptop. The crack in the wall, the shape inside the concrete, the sound that had finally found a microphone. The penthouse was officially unsaleable now. The building was never reopened. Months later, when the site stood abandoned, lights dark and windows opaque, passers-by reported a strange phenomenon on quiet nights. From certain angles, if the city was loud enough and the wind just right, the upper floors seemed to breathe glass, fogging briefly, then clearing again, as if something inside was still testing the boundary between containment and release. Evelyn never stayed above the 10th floor again, not because she believed in ghosts, but because she understood, now, that buildings remembered what people tried to forget, and that sometimes, when the pressure grew too great, they told the truth in the only way they could. Evelyn thought the end would feel louder. She expected the aftermath to come with shouting headlines, with names dragged into daylight and consequences arranged into neat, moral sentences. Instead, the story dissolved the way most uncomfortable truths did, into disclaimers, into phrases like ongoing review and no further comment, into a steady erosion of interest once the spectacle had passed and the city found something newer to stare at. The building was fenced off within a week. Metal barriers ringed its base like a surgical perimeter. Signs posted at regular intervals warning of structural instability. Windows were darkened. Power was cut. From the street, it looked like a model abandoned halfway through construction, all intention and no invitation. People stopped asking questions when there was nowhere left to go inside. Evelyn watched from a distance. She had moved into a hotel on the 9th floor low enough that the city still felt anchored, high enough that she could see the silhouette of the building at night if she stood at the window and angled her head just right. She told herself this was coincidence, habit, closure. But some nights, when sleep refused to come, she found herself standing there anyway, counting floors without meaning to. 15 was always darker than the rest. Her footage circulated for a while, clipped and reposted, the sound from inside the wall analyzed and argued over by strangers who paused the video at the exact moment the crack widened, drawing out lines around the pale shape in the concrete as if it were a puzzle that could be solved by attention alone. Skeptics called it pareidolia. Experts cited compression anomalies. Lawyers spoke carefully about liability without ever using the word man. Evelyn stopped reading the comments. What stayed with her were the quieter things. The way elevators felt different now, how she noticed the pause between floors, the subtle sway when a car settled into place, the way she woke sometimes with the sensation of being leaned toward, as if the space around her had briefly remembered a direction it preferred. She avoided balconies entirely. Windows, too, when she could help it. Daniel checked in often, concerned but gentle, careful not to push her back into explanations she no longer trusted. He never asked to see the footage again. Some things, they both seemed to understand, were not improved by repetition. Weeks passed, then months. One night, as winter edged closer and the city's breath turned visible, Evelyn's phone vibrated with a notification she hadn't expected. A private message, sent through an account she rarely used now, the username unfamiliar and untraceable. No text, just a video file. Against her better judgment, she opened it. The footage was grainy, clearly recorded on a phone from street level, angled upward toward the abandoned building. It was night. Traffic noise filled the audio, horns and engines masking subtler sounds. The camera shook slightly as the person filming adjusted their grip. For several seconds, nothing happened. Then, on the 15th floor, one of the windows fogged. It wasn't dramatic, just a thin bloom of condensation spreading across the glass from the inside, as if someone had leaned close and exhaled. The fog lingered for a moment, long enough to be unmistakable, then faded, leaving the window dark and reflective once more. The video ended. Evelyn sat very still, the phone heavy in her hand. She did not feel fear. Not exactly. What settled in her chest was something closer to responsibility, a quiet, enduring weight. The truth had been told. The building had been silenced, officially, but release, she realized, was not the same as resolution. Some things didn't want justice. They wanted acknowledgement. Evelyn deleted the video and turned off her phone. She stood and walked to the window, pressing her palm lightly against the glass, feeling the solid resistance beneath it. The city stretched out below, alive and indifferent, full of places built on compromises no one remembered until they cracked. She no longer reviewed high-rises. Her channel shifted, subtly at first, toward ground-level spaces, toward history that could be walked through and left behind. Viewers noticed the change but accepted it without question. People rarely asked why someone stepped back from the edge once they'd seen how far the fall really was. On certain nights, when the wind moved just right between buildings, Evelyn thought she could hear it again, not knocking, not breathing, but the faint suggestion of movement inside a structure that had learned, too late, what it meant to hold something it shouldn't have. She did not look up. She didn't need to, because she knew now that some places never stop reaching not for escape but for witness, and that even after the truth surfaced, it left impressions behind, pressed gently but permanently into those who had listened closely enough to hear it. The window washer's regret. The harness clicked into place with a sound Daniel had learned to trust more than his own heartbeat. Metal against metal. Final. Unforgiving. He tested the line twice, then a third time, pulling his weight back until the rope bit into the edge of the building and held. The city below him breathed in slow, distant pulses, traffic sighing. A siren somewhere far enough away to feel old, almost archival. Daniel kept his eyes forward, fixed on the glass in front of him, because looking down had become a negotiation he no longer won easily. 8 floors up, not the highest he'd ever worked, not even close, but height was no longer measured in numbers. It lived in his body now, in the way his calves tightened the moment his feet left solid ground, in the faint numbness that crept into his fingers whenever the wind shifted without warning. The anniversary sat heavy in his chest. 1 year since the accident. Daniel hadn't marked the date on purpose. He hadn't needed to. His body remembered for him the tightening in his throat, the way the morning light felt sharper than it should have. The echo of a scream he sometimes heard just before sleep claimed him. The scaffold swayed gently as he adjusted his position. Too gently. He froze. The movement wasn't wrong exactly, but it was playful. A subtle bounce that didn't match the wind or his own shifting weight. Daniel gripped the rope harder, knuckles whitening inside his gloves, and listened. The building creaked, a low groan traveling through steel and concrete. That was normal. He could explain that. What he couldn't explain was the second movement, a soft, rhythmic dip above him, like someone testing the scaffold's give with their heel. Daniel tilted his head upward. The floors above him were empty. He knew that. This side of the building wasn't scheduled for work today. No ropes, no shadows, just glass stretching skyward in clean, repeating lines. The scaffold dipped again. A sound drifted down with it. Not a voice, not quite laughter. A light, breathy sound that fluttered briefly, then vanished, as if swallowed by the open air. Daniel's pulse spiked. "Hey," he called, hating how thin his voice sounded. "You up there?" No answer. The rope vibrated faintly in his hands, a tremor that traveled down the line and settled into his arms. Daniel squeezed his eyes shut for a moment, forcing his breathing into a steady rhythm the way his therapist had taught him. "You're safe. You're clipped in. You're here. Not there." He opened his eyes and went back to work. The squeegee moved across the glass in slow, deliberate strokes, water beating and sliding downward in shimmering lines that distorted the city beyond. Daniel focused on the motion, on the familiar scrape and glide, letting muscle memory take over where thought failed him. That was when he felt it again, a downward press. Not enough to trigger the safety alarms, not enough to be called a malfunction, just enough to register his company. Daniel's gaze drifted down despite himself. 8 floors below, on the pavement far beneath him, a man stood perfectly still. He was dressed wrong for the street, long coat, dark fabric hanging heavy despite the mild weather. He didn't look up right away. Instead, he stared at the base of the building, head tilted slightly, as if studying a stain only he could see. Daniel swallowed. "Hey," he called again, louder this time. "You can't stand there." The man lifted his head. Their eyes met across the distance. The man smiled. Not wide, not friendly, just enough. Daniel's stomach dropped with the unmistakable sensation of recognition. The same cold certainty he'd felt a year ago when the scream had cut through the air, when his coworker's rope had gone slack, when gravity had finished a sentence no one else could interrupt. The scaffold above him dipped again, harder. Daniel's hands slipped on the rope, just for a second, just enough for panic to flare hot and immediate in his chest. He sucked in a breath that felt too shallow, his heart pounding so loudly he was sure it would shake him loose. The man below never looked away, and somewhere above Daniel's head, very softly, something laughed again. Daniel tried to pull himself upward. The instinct came sharp and sudden, a reflex born of panic rather than plan, his arms tensing as he hauled on the rope with more force than the movement required. The harness responded with a familiar bite against his hips, a reminder of limits, of physics, of systems designed to keep bodies where they were supposed to be. The rope did not move, not upward. Instead, it loosened just a fraction enough that Daniel felt the shift in his center of gravity, the subtle, nauseating change that told him something had been adjusted somewhere beyond his reach. The scaffold dipped in response, a smooth, controlled motion that had nothing to do with wind or weight. "No," Daniel whispered, the word lost to the open air. His gloves squeaked faintly as his grip tightened, the sound oddly loud in his ears. He glanced up again, heart hammering, scanning the empty stretch of glass and steel above him for any sign of tampering. There was nothing. No shadow, no rope, no human shape that could be blamed. The scaffold dipped again. This time, it did not bounce back. Daniel felt the unmistakable sensation of descent begin, slow and deliberate, as if someone had placed a careful hand on the controls and decided patience would make the experience more interesting. The city beyond the glass rose imperceptibly in his peripheral vision, the familiar lines of windows and floors sliding upward past him one by one. He sucked in a breath that scraped his lungs raw. "I didn't touch anything," he said aloud. "To the building, to the sky, to whatever had decided to keep him company. I'm not. This isn't. The sentence dissolved into static in his mind. The squeegee slipped from his fingers. It didn't fall. Instead, it dragged itself across the glass, pulled by a force that did not align with gravity. The rubber blade screeched softly as it carved a thin, wet line that curved sharply, looping back on itself in a shape Daniel did not recognize but felt in his gut all the same. His heart slammed harder, panic threatening to overwhelm the careful breathing he'd practiced for months. No, he said again, louder now. Stop. The tool responded by moving faster. The squeegee traced another line, then another, intersecting the first in jagged angles that made Daniel's vision blur. Water smeared and streaked under the blade, forming symbols that refused to settle into meaning but radiated intention all the same. The sound, metal and rubber against glass, cut through him, sharp and relentless, a reminder of proximity, of how little stood between him and empty air. The scaffold continued its descent. Daniel tried to fight it, bracing his feet against the platform, muscles screaming as he attempted to counter the motion with sheer will. His body shook, adrenaline flooding his system, but the movement remained smooth, unhurried, as if accommodating his resistance without acknowledging it. The city grew closer. Details sharpened faces on the sidewalk, traffic signals changing color, the gleam of car roofs catching sunlight. Daniel's stomach twisted violently as recognition bloomed. The angle, the speed, the rhythm of the descent, it was the same. A year ago, he had watched this view rush up too quickly, had felt his throat close as his coworker's body fell past him, rope slack and screaming uselessly as gravity finished the job. The memory slammed into him with brutal clarity, overriding the present, his hands trembling so badly he nearly lost his grip again. The squeegee completed its final mark. The shape on the glass resolved into something painfully familiar, a rough outline of a body, arms thrown outward, legs bent at impossible angles, frozen mid-fall. Water dripped downward from the edges, distorting it just enough to suggest motion where there should have been none. Daniel choked back sound. His safety razor, the small blade he used to scrape stubborn residue, twitched in its holder. He felt the vibration travel through the handle, up the cord, into his arm. Before he could react, it lifted itself free and pressed against the glass beside the squeegee's work. The sound changed, high-pitched, precise. The blade scraped into the surface, etching shallow lines that caught the light and refused to disappear when the water slid away. The sensation of it went straight through Daniel's skull, a metallic shriek that made his vision pulse and his thoughts fragment. Please, he gasped, the word tearing free without dignity. I couldn't, there was nothing I could do. The descent slowed, not stopped, just slowed. Daniel's harness tugged at him, pulling his weight forward until his boots barely brushed the scaffold. The city below seemed to lean up toward him, the pavement no longer abstract but intimate, familiar in the worst possible way. He was approaching the spot. He knew it without needing to look. The place where the rope had failed, the place where the scream had ended. His chest tightened until each breath felt like it might be the last. The glass in front of him darkened subtly, reflection shifting until Daniel saw it not his own face, but another, pale and stretched thin by terror, eyes wide with accusation and disbelief. You saw, a voice whispered, so close it felt like it brushed his ear. The sound did not travel through air, it traveled through memory. Daniel's body locked, muscles seizing as terror hollowed him out. His feet slipped fully off the platform now, leaving him hanging in the harness, suspended in open space as the scaffold creaked above him with renewed interest. The descent resumed, and this time, it carried intent. The first thing Daniel noticed was the silence. Not the absence of sound, there was still traffic below, the wind threading itself around the building, the faint metallic groan of the scaffold above him, but a deeper silence layered beneath it all, as if something fundamental had been muted. His own breathing sounded wrong in it, too loud and too close, each inhale scraping his chest raw. He was no longer descending. He was suspended. The harness bit into his ribs as his full weight settled into it, his boots dangling uselessly above the platform, toes brushing air that felt thinner than it should have. His arms trembled from the effort of holding himself upright, muscles burning with the kind of fatigue that made thought slippery and unreliable. Okay, he whispered, forcing the word out like an anchor. Okay, I'm here. I'm clipped in. Wheeze. The glass in front of him reflected a warped version of his face, eyes too wide, skin drained of color, mouth slightly open as if he were always just about to speak and never quite managing it. He focused on that reflection, on the proof of his own existence, until another shape began to form beside it. At first, it was only a distortion, a subtle warping of light where the city's reflection should have been. Then it sharpened, a face, not pressed against the glass like a reflection, but hovering just beyond it, features pale and indistinct, eyes fixed on Daniel with an intensity that made his stomach twist. The face looked wrong in a way Daniel couldn't articulate, flattened slightly, as if shaped by pressure rather than flesh. I didn't know, Daniel said immediately, the words tumbling out before he could stop them. I swear, I didn't know it would. The face's mouth moved. The sound that came out was familiar. Daniel's vision tunneled as recognition slammed into him with physical force. No, he breathed. No, no, no. You look down, the voice said. It wasn't distorted. It wasn't echoing. It sounded exactly the way it had a year ago, strained, breathless, carrying the faint humor his coworker had always used to soften bad situations. You looked right at me. Daniel shook his head violently, tears blurring his vision. I tried, he said. I tried to grab you. The line had snapped so fast. I couldn't. You didn't move. The voice interrupted gently. The word gently hurt the most. Daniel's harness creaked as his body swayed slightly, the building's face looming too close now. The glass filling his field of vision. The city below had gone soft and distant again, the ground no longer rushing up but waiting, patient and inevitable. I yelled. Daniel whispered. I screamed for help. You screamed after, the voice said. After I was already falling. The scaffold above him dipped, just a little, enough to send a fresh spike of terror through his body. Daniel clutched at the rope with one shaking hand, the other pressed flat against the glass as if it might steady him. I see it every time I close my eyes, he said, voice breaking. The way you dropped. The sound, the voice asked. Daniel's breath hitched. The sound, the voice repeated. Closer now, the face sharpening, features resolving into something unmistakably human and unbearably familiar. You mean the way the rope sang when it went slack? The world tilted, not downward, sideways. Daniel screamed as gravity shifted, his body swinging outward in a slow, sickening arc, the harness twisting as the rules he depended on unraveled. For a heart-stopping moment, there was no up or down, only motion, only the sensation of being pulled toward empty space from an impossible angle. The voice stayed with him. You felt it, it said calmly. The second when everything decided what was going to happen next, the part where there was still time. Daniel sobbed openly now, his chest convulsing as terror and guilt tangled until he couldn't tell where one ended and the other began. I was scared, he said. I froze. I didn't mean to. You let go, the voice said. The glass in front of him darkened completely, reflections vanishing as if swallowed by shadow. Daniel felt a sudden, sickening lightness, the harness loosening just enough to make his heart stop. Weightlessness. For a fraction of a second, he was falling again, not physically, but in memory, his body reliving the sensation with brutal fidelity. His stomach lurched, his vision exploded into static, and the scream tore out of him without restraint. Ripped free from a place deeper than lungs, the sound snapped something. The harness jerked violently, slamming Daniel back against the building with bone-jarring force. Pain flared across his shoulder as the rope caught, halting the fall before it could become real. He gasped, choking, his body trembling uncontrollably as sensation rushed back in a chaotic flood. The face in the glass receded, not vanishing, withdrawing. You remember now, the voice said softly, already fading. That's all I wanted. The scaffold above him creaked again, this time harsh and urgent, accompanied by distant shouting that cut through the silence like a lifeline. Daniel clung to the rope, eyes squeezed shut, tears streaming freely as the building around him seemed to sigh, disappointed but appeased. The last thing he felt before the voices grew louder was a brief, unsettling impression like fingers brushing past his harness, light and almost playful, testing the strength of what held him there. Then the sound of human urgency took over, and whatever had been hanging with him let go. Hands grabbed the rope above Daniel before he heard the voices. The sensation came first, an abrupt, violent tug that yanked his body upward and slammed him back against the building hard enough to knock the air from his lungs. Pain flared across his shoulder and spine as the harness took the load, metal screaming in protest as the line tightened to a halt. "Hold on, hold on!" Someone shouted. Human voices. Panicked. Real. Daniel sobbed, the sound tearing out of him without permission as the scaffold lurched and steadied, the platform rising in jerky, uneven bursts. He clung to the rope, fingers numb, vision swimming as the world slowly reassembled itself into something that obeyed rules again. The building resisted. He felt it in the rope first, a strange elasticity, like the structure itself was reluctant to give him back. The ascent stuttered, paused, then continued, each stop accompanied by a faint vibration that traveled through the line and into his bones, a lingering echo of something that had not finished with him. "Easy, easy," a voice said above him, strained with effort. "You're clear. We've got you." The words barely registered. Daniel's attention was fixed on the glass beside him. The marks were still there. The etched lines from the blade hadn't faded with water or time. They caught the light now, sharp and unmistakable, forming the outline of a falling body frozen mid-motion, arms flung outward, legs bent in surrender. Beneath it, smeared and half erased, were the looping symbols the squeegee had drawn, shapes that looked less like writing and more like momentum given form. A final sound drifted down, a light, breathy chuckle. Daniel screamed. The scaffold surged upward in response, urgency replacing caution as his co-workers hauled him the rest of the way with brute force. Hands reached for him as the platform cleared the edge of the building, gripping his arms, his harness, dragging him onto solid ground where gravity behaved itself, and the sky felt farther away. He collapsed onto the rooftop, shaking uncontrollably. Someone knelt beside him, shouting his name, checking his pupils, his pulse, his harness. Another voice barked into a radio, calling off emergency services that were already on their way. Daniel barely heard them. His eyes stayed locked on the edge, on the drop beyond it, half expecting to see a long coat waiting patiently below. Nothing stood there now. The city went on, later minutes or hours. He couldn't tell. Daniel sat wrapped in a blanket, oxygen mask pressed awkwardly to his face as paramedics hovered nearby. His coworkers stood a few steps away, voices low, eyes darting toward the building with a wariness they didn't try to hide. "What happened?" one of them asked carefully. Daniel opened his mouth. No explanation fit. He froze. Someone else said, not unkindly, "Panic attack." Probably. Daniel nodded weakly, grateful for the lie. It slid into place too easily, covering everything that clawed at the edges of his memory. He didn't look back at the building as they led him away. He didn't need to. He could still feel it. That night, after the paperwork and the quiet condolences and the promise that he should take some time, Daniel went home alone. He sat on the edge of his bed in the dark, hands shaking as he set his equipment down for the last time. The metal was wrong. The squeegee's handle was twisted, warped as if bent by slow, deliberate pressure rather than impact. The blade was curled inward, its edge folded into itself in a way that should have required tools and force far beyond what an accident could produce. Even the carabiners bore shallow indentations, faint fingerprints pressed into steel. Daniel stared at them until his eyes burned. It hadn't tried to kill him. That realization settled over him with chilling clarity. If it had wanted him dead, he would have fallen. What it had wanted was something else. Acknowledgement, confession, fear, examined and held up to the light. Daniel packed the gear away and shoved the bag into the back of his closet, burying it beneath coats he hadn't worn in years. The next morning, he called his supervisor and quit without explanation. He didn't argue when they tried to talk him out of it. Some lines, once crossed, didn't allow negotiation. Weeks later, walking through the city at street level, Daniel caught his reflection in a glass facade and flinched, instinctively stepping back. For just a moment, no longer than a blink, he thought he saw another shape beside his own, stretched, tall and thin, smiling faintly. Then the reflection shifted, and it was gone. But Daniel kept his eyes forward after that, feet firmly on the pavement, because he understood now that some things didn't need bodies to fall to feel satisfied. They only needed someone to remember how close the edge really was. Daniel learned the city again from the ground. It took weeks before his body stopped bracing for drops that weren't there, before his calves loosened when he stepped off curbs, before his hands stopped tightening around railings that no longer mattered. He took routes that hugged buildings instead of crossing open plazas. He chose cafes with low ceilings. He learned which subway platforms offered the deepest sense of enclosure and waited there, breathing in the warm, recycled air like it could anchor him. People told him he was lucky. They said he'd walked away with nothing but a scare, that panic could do strange things to the mind, that trauma liked to dress itself up as memory. He nodded when they said it. He nodded because the alternative, trying to explain what it felt like to have gravity listen to someone else, would have sounded like an invitation. At night, he dreamed of height without falling. In the dreams, he stood on edges that never ended, wind sliding around him with patient curiosity. The city below was always quiet, traffic reduced to a distant hush, and somewhere above him, always above there, was movement, not rushing, testing. The dreams never showed him the thing itself. They didn't need to. The anticipation did the work. He stopped dreaming after a while. That was worse. One afternoon, months later, Daniel passed the building where it had happened. The glass had been replaced. The etched marks were gone. From the sidewalk, it looked like any other tower, reflective and impersonal, its upper floors dissolving into cloud. He paused across the street without meaning to, hands shoved deep into his pockets, and waited for the familiar tightening in his chest. It didn't come. Instead, he noticed something else. At the top, far higher than he'd ever worked, a maintenance platform was being raised, its lines taut and orderly. The workers on it were small from this distance, their movements precise, practiced. The platform swayed once, lightly, then settled. Daniel felt a chill trace its way along his spine. The sound drifted down, not loud enough to be heard by anyone else, not clear enough to be called a voice, just a soft, breathy exhale that threaded itself through the traffic noise and found him anyway, intimate and amused. Daniel turned away. He didn't look back. He didn't need to confirm what he already understood, that it had never belonged to one building, or one scaffold, or one moment of guilt. Height was only the stage. Fear was the instrument, and regret, examined slowly, patiently, was the lever that made everything else move. That night, Daniel stood at his apartment window for the first time in months. He opened it just enough to let the air in, cool and steady, and listened to the city breathe. Somewhere, the siren wailed and faded. Somewhere, metal clicked against metal as someone secured a line and trusted it. Daniel closed the window gently. He turned off the light, and as the room settled into darkness, he felt not heard, not saw, but felt a familiar pressure lift away, as if something that had been leaning close finally lost interest and drifted upward, searching for thinner air. The city, indifferent as ever, offered it plenty of places to look. The last haircut. Max liked his scissors the way other men liked expensive watches, not because they were practical, though they were, but because they made a sound that announced competence, a precise, confident click, not rushed, not hesitant, the kind of sound that told a customer, without words, that they were being handled by someone who knew exactly what they were worth. The salon was quiet that night. Too quiet, Max thought, glancing at the empty chairs reflected in the mirror. Outside, the streetlights cast a dull yellow sheen over wet pavement, and piles of leaves pressed flat against the curb. Autumn had been generous this year, shedding everywhere, clogging gutters, staining the edges of the sidewalk with rot. Max hated it. He hated the way leaves found their way into his doorway, the way damp air carried the smell of soil inside, the way trees seemed determined to remind him that the city was never as clean as people pretended. He swept again, more out of irritation than necessity. Disgusting, he muttered. nudging a clump of wet hair and leaf fragments into the dustpan. People pay good money to sit here. The clock on the wall ticked past midnight. Max considered closing early. His last client, a finance guy with perfect teeth and an even more perfect credit card, had left satisfied, and the register hummed with the quiet promise of a good night. He reached for the lights when the door opened. The bell above it chimed once. The man who stepped inside did not belong. That was Max's first thought, immediate and absolute. The second was that the smell hit him before anything else, a thick, earthy stench that cut through the artificial citrus cleaner and expensive hair products, clinging to the air like an accusation. The old man was thin to the point of collapse, shoulders hunched beneath a coat that looked less worn than grown. Mud streaked the hem, and patches of dark green clung stubbornly to the fabric, moss or algae or something that should not have been inside a business that prided itself on cleanliness. His boots left damp marks on the floor with every step. Max didn't bother hiding his disgust. "We're closed," he said sharply, already reaching for the broom again, as if sweeping could erase the intrusion. "Come back during business hours." The old man stopped just inside the doorway. Water dripped from his sleeves, pattering softly against the tile. The sound was slow, deliberate, as if the man were leaking rather than wet. "I won't take long," the old man said. His voice was rough, scraped raw, but not weak. It carried a weight that made Max pause despite himself, fingers tightening around the broom handle. "No," Max snapped. "I don't do charity cuts, and I don't do whatever this is." He gestured vaguely at the man's appearance. "Go somewhere else." Instead, the old man smiled. It wasn't friendly. "Toiknai," he said, switching languages without warning, then correcting himself. "This hair, it is fed by the land." Max scoffed. "Buddy, you need a shower, not a haircut." The old man stepped closer. Up close, Max could see that the man's hair was thick, unnaturally so. Strands clumped together, dark and coarse, with bits of dirt and leaf matter woven through it as if by design. It didn't hang the way hair should. It branched, split, twisted. "You will cut it," the old man said calmly. "Everyone does, eventually." Max felt a flicker of irritation sharpen into anger. "Out," he said, voice hard. "Now." For a moment, neither of them moved. Then the old man reached into his coat and withdrew a folded stack of paper, held together with a brittle band of twine. He placed it on the nearest counter with a soft, deliberate tap. The bills were old, too old. The paper was yellowed, edges uneven, symbols unfamiliar at first glance. Max frowned despite himself, leaning closer. They looked valuable, collectible, maybe. The kind of thing rich eccentrics paid ridiculous money for. The old man's eyes never left his. "Midnight is when roots listen," he said. "You complain about the mess, about the trees. Tonight you will understand what feeds what." A cold prickle crawled up Max's spine. He straightened abruptly, pushing the money back across the counter. "Get out," he repeated, louder now, "before I call someone." But man, the old man gathered the bills slowly, his movements unhurried, as if time were something he possessed in excess. At the door, he paused. "Children will come," he said over his shoulder. "They will pay better." The bell chimed again as he left. The smell lingered. Max stood alone in his salon, heart beating faster than it should have, scissors still warm in his hand. He told himself it was nothing, just another lunatic wandering in off the street, another reminder that the city let too many things grow unchecked. Outside, a gust of wind rattled the trees lining the road. Dry leaves scraped softly against the glass, and for reasons Max could not explain, the sound made his fingers ache. Max slept poorly that night, not because of fear he refused to give the old man that satisfaction, but because his hands would not relax. Even in sleep, his fingers twitched, curling and uncurling as if still holding scissors, muscles remembering the weight and balance of metal they had known for years. He woke just before dawn with a dull ache running from his wrists to his elbows, the kind of soreness that usually followed a long day of work, except he hadn't cut a single head of hair since the old man had left. By noon, he had convinced himself it meant nothing. The city was loud again, alive in the way Max preferred cars, voices, credit cards swiping cleanly through machines that approved or declined with satisfying finality. He opened the salon, swept away the last of the leaves that had crept in overnight, and sprayed enough disinfectant to bury the faint, lingering scent of damp earth that no amount of logic could quite explain. It was late afternoon when the children arrived. There were 4 of them, maybe 5, standing just outside the glass door and staring in with open, unblinking curiosity. They were quiet in a way that immediately set Max on edge, not whispering, not fidgeting, not behaving like children at all. Their clothes were mismatched and outdated, jackets a size too large, shoes scuffed thin, as if they had wandered in from a different season entirely. Max sighed. "We don't do kids' cuts without appointments," he said through the door, already irritated. One of them, a girl with hair cropped unevenly around her ears, held up a bundle of paper. "Payment," she said. The word was spoken carefully, as if learned rather than understood. Against his better judgment, Max unlocked the door. The children stepped inside without hesitation, bringing with them the faint rustle of dry leaves, though none clung visibly to their clothes. The air shifted, cooling just slightly, and Max felt the same dull ache flare in his hands. "I'm busy," he said, glancing at the paper. "Come back with the parent." The girl placed the bundle on the counter. It was money, or something pretending to be. The bills were old in the same unsettling way as the ones the old man had shown him, yellowed, brittle, marked with symbols that looked almost familiar but never quite resolved into anything recognizable. Max picked one up despite himself, rubbing it between his fingers. It felt wrong, too fibrous, too dry. "Where did you get this?" he asked. The children exchanged glances, a silent communication that excluded him entirely. "He's waiting," the girl said. Max's jaw tightened. "I already told him no." The children didn't react. "He's waiting," the boy beside her repeated, voice flat. In the place where the trees were cut wrong, that should have been the moment Max threw them out. Instead, something colder and more practical slid into place inside him. The bills might be fake, but they might also be rare. Collectors paid obscene amounts for nonsense if it came with a story, and the address, whatever strange location the children were hinting at, could be an easy way to settle the matter once and for all. Go, prove there was nothing there, come back with peace of mind and maybe a story to tell. "Where?" Max asked, already regretting the word. The children smiled. Not widely, not happily, just enough. The drive took him farther than he liked. Streetlights thinned, then vanished entirely, replaced by a narrow road that twisted through stretches of forest the city had not yet managed to tame. The trees crowded close to the asphalt, trunks scarred and uneven, branches reaching overhead in a way that blocked out the sky. Max rolled down the window despite himself, the air cool and heavy with the smell of soil and decay. Leaves crunched under his tires. Eventually, the road ended. Max parked at the edge of a clearing and stepped out, the silence pressing in immediately, thick and watchful. The forest around him was wrong in a way he couldn't articulate. Trees stood too far apart in some places, too close in others, their tops jagged and uneven as if hacked down and left to regrow without care. In the center of the clearing sat a single chair. The old man was already in it. He looked exactly as he had the night before, mud-streaked, thin, patient. His coat blended into the darkness behind him, edges indistinct. Around him, tree stumps jutted from the ground at awkward angles, their exposed rings pale and raw, sap long dried into dark scars. Max swallowed. "You said you wouldn't take long," the old man said mildly. The children stood at the edge of the clearing now, silent observers, their outlines blurring into shadow as if they were already halfway gone. Max's irritation flared, sharp and defensive. "You tricked me," he said. "This money." The old man raised a hand. "Payment comes later," he said. "First the work." He gestured to his head. Up close, the hair was worse than Max remembered. It didn't fall naturally. It rose in thick, matted clumps, coarse and dark, threaded with dirt and something fibrous that resisted the wind. Max reached out automatically, professional reflex overriding fear, and froze when his fingers brushed it. It was stiff, not dry, alive. He pulled his hand back, heart hammering. "I don't cut hair like this," he he said. The old man tilted his head slightly, considering. You cut what grows, he replied. You always have. The forest sighed, leaves shifted, branches creaked, and before Max could step away, the scissors in his pocket felt suddenly heavy, as if they had been waiting for this moment too. Max had cut thousands of heads in his life. Emotion was muscle memory now. Angle, tension, release. He could do it without thinking, without looking, his hands responding to texture and resistance the way a musician's fingers responded to keys. That familiarity was the only reason he didn't run when he raised the scissors and brought them close to the old man's head. The first snip stopped him cold. The scissors didn't slide through. They resisted. Max frowned, adjusting his grip, applying more pressure. The blades closed with a strained metallic squeal that scraped painfully against his nerves. Whatever he had cut did not fall away. It recoiled, pulling back slightly, as if the act had been noticed. The forest reacted, somewhere behind him. Wood cracked, not the dry snap of a fallen branch, but the deeper, wetter sound of something torn from where it had grown for years. Max flinched, heart hammering, and looked past the old man into the trees. A nearby trunk shuddered. A thin split crawled down its bark, sap oozing sluggishly from the wound, dark and sticky in the low light. The smell hit him immediately sharp, green, unmistakably alive. Max's mouth went dry. That's not... He started. Continue, the old man said softly. Max swallowed and cut again. This time, the resistance was undeniable. The hair, or whatever it was, pulled against the blades, fibers stretching, before parting with a sound that made Max's stomach lurch. The moment it separated, a deeper groan rolled through the clearing, spreading outward like a ripple. Leaves trembled overhead. Somewhere farther back, another tree cracked, its top sagging as if suddenly exhausted. The severed strand fell into Max's hand. It was not hair. It was a root, pale on the inside, rough and fibrous on the outside, still faintly warm, still carrying a subtle vibration that thrummed against his palm. Max dropped it with a sharp gasp, backing away until his heel struck a stump and nearly sent him sprawling. I'm not doing this, he said, voice shaking. This isn't, you complained, the old man interrupted calmly. About the mess, about the leaves, about the way they kept growing where you didn't want them. Max's chest tightened. That doesn't mean you cut him anyway, the old man said, his voice gaining weight. You cut what grows. You shape it. You decide what stays neat and what is thrown away. The old man's hair shifted subtly, thick clumps lifting and settling like a living canopy. Max stared at it in horror, recognition blooming too late. Each strand branched, each clump twisted downward, each cut line led somewhere deeper. The scissors trembled in his hand. Max tried to step back, but his feet wouldn't obey. The ground beneath him felt wrong, spongy, uneven, as if he were standing on something layered and compressed rather than soil. His fingers burned with a deep, aching pain that spread up his arms, the same soreness he'd woken with that morning, now amplified to an almost unbearable intensity. Finish, the old man said. No, Max whispered. The forest leaned closer. Branches creaked overhead, shadows shifting as if the trees were adjusting their view. Max felt watched not by eyes, but by attention, a collective awareness focused sharply on his hands. He cut again. The sound this time was a scream, not from the old man, from everywhere else. Trees shuddered violently, bark splitting, leaves raining down in a sudden, suffocating shower. The ground convulsed, roots tearing free beneath the surface, and Max staggered, barely keeping his balance as the clearing transformed around him. Each cut he made echoed outward, a mirrored wound carved into the forest itself. Stop, Max cried, dropping to his knees. Please, please, I'll pay you, The old man leaned forward for the first time, his face close enough now that Max could see the fine cracks running through his skin, lines filled with dark soil and flecks of moss. Now, the old man said gently, cut deeper. Max's gaze dropped to the base of the old man's neck. There, where hair met skin, the roots thickened, plunging downward into the body itself. merging seamlessly with something older and more fundamental. Max understood with sickening clarity that this wasn't a haircut. It was pruning. His hands moved without his permission. The scissors bit down. The resistance was immense. The sound was catastrophic. Roots tore free with a wet, ripping scream that shook the clearing. Trees collapsing inward, as if pulled by invisible strings. Max felt the pain surge through his arms, up into his shoulders, exploding behind his eyes. He screamed too, the sound lost in the chaos as the forest convulsed around him. Then, silence. Abrupt. Absolute. Max collapsed forward, scissors slipping from his numb fingers as darkness surged up to meet him. The last thing he felt before losing consciousness was the strange, unbearable sensation of his hands sinking into soil that felt warm and familiar. Max woke to the sound of wind moving through dead things. At first, he thought it was rain, thin, brittle, tapping insistently against his face, but when he forced his eyes open, the sky above him was clear and pale. The early light washed thin as if color itself were reluctant to arrive. Leaves scraped softly across the ground, dry and weightless, collecting in shallow drifts around his body. He was lying in the forest, not the clearing, not the chair. Just trees, too many of them, too close, their trunks pale and stripped, bark hanging in ragged sheets like skin after a burn. The stumps were still there, but now they were worse. Jagged, splintered, hacked down with a violence that felt personal, as if whatever had cut them had been angry, impatient, and thorough. Max tried to sit up. Pain exploded through his hands. He cried out, clutching them to his chest. His fingers were swollen, joints stiff and throbbing, palms crisscrossed with shallow cuts that oozed a dark, sticky residue. It smelled faintly green. Alive, he turned his hands over slowly, dread pooling heavy in his stomach. The scissors were gone. In their place, clutched tight in his right hand as if he'd never let go, was a thick wad of paper bound with twine. Money, or what passed for it. Max fumbled with shaking fingers, tearing the bundle open. The bills spilled onto the forest floor in a brittle cascade, and his breath caught as he saw them clearly for the first time. They were leaves, pressed flat and dried thin, veins branching across their surfaces in patterns that mimicked currency circles where faces should have been, lines where serial numbers might exist, some still crumbled at the edges, flaking away into dust at his touch. No, Max whispered. A memory surfaced then, unbidden and sharp, the old man's words, spoken calmly across the counter. Payment comes later. Max staggered to his feet, the forest spinning around him, and began to walk. He didn't know the direction at first. He followed the road when he found it, boots crunching through leaf litter that felt thicker than it should have been, heavier, as if the ground itself were trying to slow him down. It took hours to reach the city. The first thing he noticed was the silence. No birds, no insects, just wind. The trees lining the road were wrong. Where there should have been dense canopies and tangled branches, there were only trunks cleanly severed at odd heights, as if cut down by someone who had never learned how to stop. Fresh stumps dotted the ground in places that made no sense, some no wider than a wrist, others thick and ancient, all reduced to the same brutal finality. Max's stomach churned. By the time he reached his neighborhood, the dread had settled into something colder and more permanent. The familiar streets looked stripped, exposed. Every tree he passed had been cut down, not carefully, not by city workers, but hacked and torn, branches ripped away and left where they fell. It looked like rage. Max ran the last block to his building, lungs burning, hands screaming with every jolt of movement. He burst through the front door and stumbled inside, heart pounding, only to skid to a stop in the lobby. The potted plants were dead, not wilted, not neglected. Dead. Their leaves lay scattered across the tile floor, dry and curled, soil spilled from cracked pots as if the roots had been yanked free. The smell was unmistakable, now raw, green, violent. Max backed away, shaking. He made it up to his apartment and collapsed against the door, sliding down to the floor as his hands finally gave out, fingers curling uselessly against his palms. The ache in them had deepened into something else, a dull, persistent throb that pulsed in time with his heartbeat. Outside his window, the wind rose. It howled through a city suddenly full of dead wood, carrying with it the soft, endless sound of leaves breaking down into dust. Max pressed his forehead against the door, eyes squeezed shut, the image of roots tearing free replaying behind his lids. He understood now. The old man hadn't taken payment. He had returned it, and the cost of Max's pride, of his disgust, of his careless complaints about what grew where he didn't want it, had been measured, not in money, but in balance, somewhere far away. Something vast and patient had been trimmed too hard, and it had responded in kind. The city tried to explain it. At first, officials spoke carefully, choosing words that sounded professional and distant disease, blight, coordinated vandalism. News anchors gestured at maps where green patches vanished overnight, replaced by gray. Experts argued on morning shows about soil conditions and invasive insects, about stress fractures and municipal neglect. No one said revenge. Max watched it all from his apartment, curtains half drawn, hands wrapped in bandages that never quite stayed clean. The cuts refused to heal properly. The skin around them had toughened, calloused too fast, lines deepening into patterns that reminded him uncomfortably of veins and leaves. He stopped going outside unless he had to. When he did, he kept his eyes on the pavement. It was easier not to see the way streets look naked without trees, shadows too sharp, sunlight too harsh. The wind had changed too. Without leaves to soften it, it moved differently faster, more aggressive, carrying grit and dust that stung the eyes and scraped the throat. At night, Max dreamed of scissors, not the sleek ones from his salon, but crude, oversized things, their blades made of bark and rust, closing slowly around anything that dared to grow. In the dreams, hands like his guided them, not human hands anymore, but thickened, rooted things that did not understand mercy, only balance. He woke each time with his fingers aching. The salon closed within a month. Clients stopped coming once the street lost its shade, once the air inside grew stale and brittle despite the filters Max ran day and night. Plants in the window died first, then the smaller things, brushes cracking, wooden handles splitting without reason, hair turning dry and unmanageable the moment it touched the floor. Max tried cutting again once. A regular, someone wealthy and impatient, sat down and complained about the heat, about the mess outside, about how ugly the city had become. Max lifted his scissors and felt them tremble violently in his grip, metal screaming as if dragged across stone. The client laughed nervously, then stopped laughing when the lights flickered and the mirror behind them filled briefly with the image of roots spreading where reflections should have been. Max dropped the scissors and never picked them up again. On the anniversary of that night, a year after the old man had first stepped into his shop, Max walked to the edge of the city. The forest was still there, what remained of it, but it was thinner now, regrowth twisted and uneven, saplings sprouting in strange clusters, leaves misshapen, bark split by patterns that looked almost deliberate. Nature had returned, but cautiously, as if testing whether it would be cut again. Max knelt at the edge of the dirt road, ignoring the pain in his hands, and pressed his palms flat against the soil. It was warm, not comfortingly so, just aware. "I'm sorry," he said, the words small and useless as they left his mouth. The wind moved through the damaged trees, branches creaking softly. Leaves few and fragile trembled but did not fall. For a moment, Max thought he felt something loosen, some fraction of the pressure lifting, as if the ground acknowledged the sound without accepting it. He understood then that apology was not restoration. Balance did not mean forgiveness. It meant memory. Max stood and walked back toward the city, leaving the forest behind. As he did, one of the young trees at the edge of the road bent slightly, its thin branches scraping together with a sound uncomfortably close to the click of scissors closing. Max did not turn around. He knew now that some cuts never healed cleanly and that when nature was forced into someone else's idea of neatness, what grew back would remember the shape of the blade, the fatal diagnosis. The heart monitor never screamed. That was the detail that stayed with Doctor Anna Reed long after the room had emptied and the body had been covered, long after the orderly had wiped down the bed rails and the floor shone again with the false cleanliness of disinfectant. The machine did not shriek or flatline dramatically the way it did in training videos. It simply slowed, one measured beep stretching into another, until the rhythm lost interest in continuing. Beep, 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 and then silence. Anna stood at the foot of the bed, gloved hands resting uselessly at her sides, staring at the stillness where motion had been moments before. The air smelled of antiseptic and copper. A ventilator hissed softly nearby, finishing a task it no longer needed to perform. Her colleague, Dr. Marcus Bell, lay on the mattress with his eyes half open, expression caught somewhere between confusion and apology. He had been speaking seconds earlier, joking, even. Something about needing coffee after the shift ended. Then his hand had gone to his chest. Then the room had changed. Anna replayed the last words in her head, whether she wanted to or not. The sentence Marcus had repeated with strange insistence just before his knees buckled and she'd caught him under the arms. You will not survive tomorrow. At the time, she had assumed it was shock talking, trauma-induced delirium. The patient they had just treated, a man brought in barely alive after a late-night accident, had lost a frightening amount of blood. The stress had been high, the prognosis uncertain. People said strange things under those conditions. Anna had believed that. She believed it right up until Marcus died in her hands. The official explanation came quickly. Acute cardiac failure. Sudden. Unpredictable. Tragic. The words slid neatly into place, supported by charts and numbers and the comfortable lie that medicine understood more than it didn't. Anna nodded when they told her. She signed what needed to be signed. She washed her hands until the skin burned. It wasn't until hours later, alone in the on-call room, that the unease sharpened into something she could no longer ignore. She pulled up Marcus's vitals, then her own, and then the records of the patient they had treated together. 5 names appeared on her screen. 5 people who had been in that trauma bay. 5 people who had touched the patient. 5 people whose charts now showed the same subtle anomaly. Anna leaned closer, heart thudding in her ears. The numbers were almost normal. Almost. Slight irregularities in heart rhythm. Brief, unexplained dips in oxygen saturation. Nothing severe enough to trigger alarms yet, but enough to suggest a pattern if you knew where to look. She swallowed. The patient's name sat at the top of the list. Grayed out now. Marked deceased. Anna remembered his eyes. He had been conscious when they brought him in. Barely. His body broken in ways that should have killed him already. Yet his gaze had been sharp, unsettlingly present. He had gripped Marcus's sleeve with surprising strength while Anna worked, fingers digging in like anchors. You should go, he had whispered. Marcus had laughed it off. Anna hadn't. She pulled up the EKGs again, overlaying them one by one. They matched, not perfectly, but closely enough. Her pulse quickened, breath coming shallow as a thought formed that had no place in a hospital, no place in a mind trained to reject anything it couldn't test or treat. This isn't a condition. It's a sentence. The monitor in the next room beeped steadily, indifferent to her realization. Anna sat back slowly, the weight of the night pressing down on her chest, and understood with sickening clarity that whatever had entered that trauma bay had not left when the patient died. It had stayed, and it was counting. They sealed the ward before dawn, not with panic, not with shouting, just a quiet escalation of protocol that Anna recognized instantly. Red tape doors slid shut. Access badges were revoked without explanation. A nurse she barely knew handed her a mask and avoided eye contact, as if fear were contagious. Temporary isolation, someone said, voice practiced, out of an abundance of caution. Anna almost laughed. 5 of them sat in the glass-walled room that used to be a recovery bay, spaced apart like variables in an experiment that no one wanted to name. The monitors hummed steadily, the rhythm meant to reassure. IV lines hung unused. Ready. The air filtration system whispered overhead, cycling and recirculating as if purity could be engineered. Anna scanned the faces. There was Paul, the respiratory therapist, rubbing his sternum absently as though trying to warm it. Maya, a surgical resident, pale and rigid, fingers locked together so tightly her knuckles had gone white. Dr. Levin, older, cardiology, staring at the floor with the hollow focus of someone who had already started to do the math. and Nurse Carla, who kept glancing at the window every few minutes, lips moving in silent counts. 5. Marcus should have been there. Anna forced herself into motion, into roll. She checked vitals, reviewed telemetry, asked questions that kept her hands busy, and her voice steady. Medicine still worked, she told herself. It had to. Whatever this was, it would yield to data, to intervention, to the relentless logic that had carried her through worse nights than this. Paul coughed. It was a small sound, barely noticeable, but Anna felt it like a crack in glass. She turned, just as he staggered forward, hand clutching at his chest with sudden, desperate force. The monitor reacted instantly, alarm shrieking as his heart rhythm spiked, then faltered. "Paul," Anna said sharply, already moving. "Stay with me. Look at me." His eyes were wide, unfocused. His mouth opened as if to speak, but no sound came out. He collapsed, body folding in on itself with terrible inevitability, and Anna caught him just as she had caught Marcus hours earlier. History repeated itself. CPR, epinephrine, defibrillation. Nothing changed. The monitor slowed. Beep, beep, beep. Anna slammed her palm against the mattress, a raw, helpless sound tearing out of her throat before she could stop it. The others watched in silence, terror calcifying into something quieter and more dangerous. They didn't ask if he would survive. They already knew the answer. Hours blurred together after that. Time lost its shape, measured only by the steady deterioration of numbers that no intervention could halt. One by one, their vitals drifted out of alignment, hearts misfiring with the same subtle irregularity Anna had seen in the charts. No infection, no toxin, no embolism, nothing medicine could name. At some point, Anna never remembered exactly when Maya began to cry. Not loudly, just a thin, shaking sound that slipped through her clenched teeth. Dr. Levin sat beside her and did nothing, hands folded in his lap as if waiting for a verdict. Nurse Carla was the first to notice the figure outside the window. She stiffened, breath-catching, eyes fixed on the dark glass that separated them from the world beyond. Anna followed her gaze reluctantly, a part of her already certain of what she would see. A man stood there. He wore a hospital gown, pale fabric fluttering slightly in the filtered air. His body was intact now, no blood, no broken bones, but his face was wrong. Too calm, too aware. His eyes met Anna's through the glass, and he smiled with gentle familiarity. Recognition hit her like a physical blow. It was the patient, the man who had died on the table. He lifted one hand and pressed it lightly against the window. His mouth moved. No sound passed through, but Anna understood anyway. "Tomorrow," Maya screamed. No sound came out, just the shape of it. Her mouth stretched wide as her body convulsed with terror. The metal door behind them clanged as the lock engaged automatically, sealing them in completely. Anna felt her phone vibrate uselessly in her pocket as every external signal died at once. The patient outside the glass tilted his head, considering them with something like pity. Anna backed away slowly, heart hammering, the full weight of the truth crashing down around her. This wasn't a disease, it was a deadline, and tomorrow was already getting closer. Anna remembered the nurse's voice because it had never asked for belief. It had been a throwaway comment months ago, spoken during a slow night shift when the monitors hummed evenly and the hospital pretended to be at rest. Nurse Evelyn, near retirement, hands permanently stained by iodine and time, had been telling a story no one had asked for while labeling samples. Some illnesses, she'd said mildly, aren't meant to be cured. They're meant to be redirected. Anna had smiled politely back then, filed it away with the other fragments of folklore that older staff carried like comfort objects. Hospitals accumulated them the way walls accumulated. Grime rituals, sayings, half-believed warnings passed down between people who'd seen too much to be fully rational. Now, sealed inside a glass room with 4 people whose hearts were counting down in unison, the memory returned with disturbing clarity. Anna pulled her phone from her pocket and checked the signal out of habit, knowing it would be gone. It was. No bars, no Wi-Fi, nothing. The hospital's isolation protocols were absolute, except for one device. The satellite phone sat in a locked cabinet near the emergency exit. reserved for disasters that knocked out infrastructure itself. Anna had signed off on its existence dozens of times without ever touching it. Now she crossed the room and cracked the seal with hands that shook despite her effort to steady them. Dr. Levin watched her closely. "That won't help," he said quietly. "It might," Anna replied. "Just not the way you're thinking." The call connected on the third attempt. Static flooded the line, thick and aggressive, until a voice pushed through old, calm, unhurried. "You are late," the voice said. Anna's breath caught. "You know why I'm calling." "I know who is calling," the voice corrected gently. "And I know what follows you." She swallowed hard. The clinical language she relied on abandoning her completely. 5 of us were exposed. 1 is already dead. The others won't survive tomorrow. A pause. Then, "Tomorrow is generous." The voice belonged to a man who did not introduce himself. He didn't need to. Nurse Evelyn's words filled in the rest anesthetic. A healer who lived beyond registries and systems. Someone people sought when nothing else answered. "A curse," Anna said flatly. "That's what this is, isn't it?" "Yes," the man replied without hesitation. The spoken sentence, anchored to pain. It moves by recognition, not proximity. Anna closed her eyes. Outside the glass, the patient's reflection lingered faintly, watching. How do we stop it? Another pause, longer this time. "You cannot stop a sentence once it has been spoken," the man said. "But you can make it lose its subject." Anna felt something inside her go very still. "Explain." "The curse searches for names," he said. "Records, faces, continuity. It moves along the path that says this person is still here." Her mind raced. Medical charts, ID bands, databases. "So, we erase ourselves." "Not yourselves," he said. "One of you." Silence pressed in around her, heavy and absolute. "Someone must step out of the sentence entirely," the man continued. "No records, no identity that can be followed. The curse will circle, fail to locate its target, and collapse inward." Anna opened her eyes slowly. "And the others, they will live," he said. Confused, exhausted, alive, her heart pounded. "What happens to the one who steps out?" "That depends," the man replied, "on how thoroughly they leave." Anna glanced around the room. Maya sat curled in on herself, eyes red and unfocused. Dr. Levin stared at his hands like they no longer belonged to him. Nurse Carla whispered something under her breath, counting again. The monitors ticked on, steady but wrong. Each beep a reminder that time was narrowing. "I'm the only one who knows how to do this," Anna said quietly. "Yes, they'll look for me." "They will," the man agreed. "You must not be found." Adrenaline. Anna exhaled slowly, feeling the weight of the decision settle not as fear, but as clarity. Medicine had trained her to triage, to choose who could be saved with the tools available. This was no different. "Tell me how," she said. The instructions came in fragments, ritualistic in cadence, but precise in execution. Destroy records, remove identifiers, leave no digital trace intact, sever continuity until even memory began to fray. When the call ended, the static lingered for a moment before dissolving into silence. Anna stood alone with the knowledge of what she would have to give up. Not her life, her existence. Outside the glass, the patient smiled once more, then stepped back, his reflection thinning as if the world itself had begun to lose track of where he was meant to look. Tomorrow was still coming, but for the first time since Marcus died, Anna knew it might arrive without taking everyone with it. Anna started with the smallest things. The hospital bracelet came off first. She slid it from her wrist and stared at the printed name, read, Anna, the barcode still warm from her skin. For a moment, an absurd thought crossed her mind. What if I keep it? What if this is enough? Then the heart monitor beside Maya hiccuped, a brief stutter that made everyone look up at once. And the moment passed. Anna tore the bracelet cleanly in half. The monitor steadied. No one said anything. They all felt it, the subtle shift, like pressure easing in a sealed room. Anna swallowed and moved on before doubt could catch up with her. She logged into the terminal at the nurse's station using credentials that had been hers since residency. The screen greeted her by name. She deleted her active shift assignment first, then her future schedule. One confirmation dialogue after another blinked onto the screen, each asking politely if she was sure. She was. As the files disappeared, Anna felt something loosen in her chest, a sensation so unexpected it nearly brought her to her knees. Not relief, lightness, as if the world were slowly forgetting how much weight she had been carrying. Behind her, Dr. Levin's monitor chimed softly. "Anna," he said, voice tentative. My heart rate is stabilizing. She didn't turn around. "Don't read into it yet," she said, forcing calm into her tone. "We're not done. Next were the records." Anna accessed the patient database, fingers moving with mechanical precision as she flagged her own profile for archival deletion. Name, date of birth, medical license number. Each keystroke felt like a small amputation, a deliberate removal of proof that she had ever existed in this system. The patient outside the window reacted. He drifted closer to the glass, expression tightening, not angry, not afraid, but confused. His outline wavered slightly, edges blurring as if the air itself had trouble holding him in place. Anna met his gaze. "This isn't how sentences work," she whispered. "You don't get to keep me." She deleted the final record. The lights flickered overhead, then steadied. Somewhere deep in the building, a door unlocked with a metallic thunk that echoed down the corridor like a punctuation mark. Nurse Carla gasped. "The door. It's opening," Maya said, eyes wide. "Anna, it's opening." "Inside," Blake said. Anna nodded once. She pulled her phone from her pocket and powered it down, then cracked the casing against the edge of the desk until the screen spiderwebbed uselessly. She removed the battery and dropped both pieces into a biohazard bin, watching them disappear among discarded gloves and gauze, one by one. She erased herself. Outside the glass, the patient's reflection thinned further, his features slipping out of alignment, his mouth opening as if to speak a name that no longer landed anywhere. His hand pressed against the window again, but this time, the glass did not fog. He frowned. Anna felt it then, the pull. Not physical, not painful, more like a draft, a quiet invitation to step sideways out of something that no longer recognized her shape. Her vision dimmed at the edges, the room losing sharpness as if depth itself were becoming optional. "Anna," Maya said softly, "what happens to you now?" Anna allowed herself a small smile. "I don't know," she admitted, "but it won't be here." The heart monitors around the room beeped in steady, healthy rhythm now. No alarms, no stutters, just life, continuing stubbornly, unremarkable and miraculous. The patient outside the window took a step back, then another. With a final look, something like regret, something like resignation, he dissolved into the reflection of the room itself, leaving only glass and darkness behind. The ward lights brightened, the isolation alarm disengaged. Anna felt the moment close around her like a door she alone could still hear. She removed her lab coat and folded it neatly on the counter, smoothing the fabric one last time. The name stitched above the pocket meant nothing now. She left it there and walked toward the emergency exit as if following instructions she'd known her whole life. No one tried to stop her. By the time the sun rose, Dr. Anna Reed no longer appeared in any system the hospital maintained, and the cursed sentence stripped of a subject had nowhere left to go. They discharged the others 2 days later. Officially, the incident became an anomaly, an unexplained cardiac cascade, statistically improbable but medically inconvenient rather than impossible. Committees were formed, language softened, charts were reviewed until meaning dulled into probability. The hospital moved on, because hospitals always did. 4 people returned to their lives with the uneasy gratitude of survivors. Maya took a leave of absence she never fully explained, hands still shaking whenever she heard a monitor alarm in passing. Dr. Levin retired earlier than planned, declining interviews, refusing panels, his cardiology texts left untouched, on a shelf he no longer looked at. Nurse Carla transferred to pediatrics, unable to step into isolation wards without her throat tightening. None of them spoke Anna's name. Not because they were told not to, but because each time they tried, the thought slipped sideways, incomplete, like reaching for a word that dissolved mid-syllable. They remembered being saved. They remembered terror. They remembered a woman's voice giving instructions with impossible calm, but her face blurred. Her name refused to stay put. Her existence settled into the vague certainty that someone had done what was necessary. The curse never returned. Heart rhythms normalized. Sleep came back slowly, cautiously. Life resumed with the strange humility of people who had learned how thin the margin really was. Somewhere far from the hospital, far from databases and cameras and records, a woman learned how to be unremarkable. She woke before dawn and went to sleep when the light faded. She worked small jobs that required no paperwork and asked no questions. She learned which places remembered people too closely and avoided them. She moved often, never long enough for habits to grow roots. She had no mirror that belonged only to her. When she caught a reflection in windows or water, it startled her not because she didn't recognize herself, but because the world did not react. No subtle acknowledgement, no invisible indexing. She existed only where she stood, and nowhere else. At night, she listened, not for voices, not for curses, but for the simple, steady proof of continuation. Wind moving through open air, distant traffic, her own breath arriving and leaving without being measured. Sometimes, she dreamed of a hospital room with glass walls and quiet machines. In those dreams, the monitors beeped evenly, endlessly, as if time itself had agreed to keep going. She always woke before the alarms ever sounded. Once, years later, she passed a small roadside clinic and paused without knowing why. Through a window, she saw a young doctor adjusting a patient's IV with careful hands, expression focused, unafraid. The sight filled her with something warm and distant pride, maybe, or grief. She did not go inside. She kept walking, because some lives were meant to be documented, tracked, remembered, and others were meant to exist only in the spaces between systems, carrying the quiet knowledge that survival sometimes demanded not heroism, not sacrifice of the body, but something far harder. The willingness to be forgotten, and somewhere, in a world that could no longer find her by name, a woman without a chart or a record or a future appointment lived on, not as a ghost, not as a myth, but as the unanswered cost of everyone else's tomorrow. You've reached the end of tonight's broadcast. If you're still awake, that's all right. Some stories are meant to linger, to sit quietly in the back of your thoughts and wait for the lights to go out. If you're drifting off, let the last sounds fade naturally. Let the unfinished questions stay unfinished. The mind knows what to do with them when it's ready. Remember, fear doesn't always come from what we see, but from what we almost understand. The places we left behind, the moments we chose not to act, the names that quietly disappear from records and memory. Wherever you are now, make sure the doors are locked, the windows are closed, and the night is allowed to be just the night. This channel will be here when you need another story. Until then, sleep well, and if something feels slightly off tomorrow, don't worry. It probably always was. Good night.